So now we will discuss the importance of secure coding practices in the API development and how to incorporate API security testing into the development process. Secure coding practices are crucial in API development to ensure the security and the integrity of the data that flows through the system. APIs are frequently targeted by attackers to gain unauthorized access to sensitive information or to exploit vulnerabilities in the code. The use of secure coding practices helps to prevent these attacks by reducing the risk of vulnerabilities being introduced into the code. Here are some ways to incorporate API security testing into the development process. First of all, we have to start threat modeling. Begin by identifying potential risks and threats that could arise in the API system. This will help you design and develop the API and the security in mind from the beginning. So this is the first step of it. So the first step in incorporating API security testing into the development process is to begin with a threat model. A threat model is a structured approach to identifying and assessing potential threats and risks to the system. By creating a threat model, developers can add, design, and develop the API system with security in mind from the beginning. Here are some key steps in creating a threat model for an API system. First, we have to identify the asset. So identification of the assets that are important to protect, such as user data, authentication tokens, and other sensitive information that flows through the API. Next, we have to identify potential threats. Identifying potential threat that could compromise the security of the API system. These could include attacks such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and man-in-the-middle attacks. Next, we have to assess the impact of threats. Assess the potential impact of each identified threat on the API system and its assets. Consider the likelihood of the threat occurring, the potential consequences if it does occur, and the measures that can be taken to mitigate the risk. Fourth one, we have design security controls. So it helps to us to mitigate the risk identified in the threat assessment. Security controls include things like authentication and authorization mechanisms, encryption of data in transit and at rest, and access control mechanism. Fifth one, we have test security controls. So we have to test the effectiveness of the security controls through vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and other security testing techniques. So by following these steps, developers can create a comprehensive threat model that identifies potential security risks and implements security controls to mitigate those risks. This can help to ensure that the API system is designed and developed with security in mind from the beginning, reducing the risk of security vulnerabilities being introduced into the code. The next one we have to use secure coding practices. So developers should use secure coding practices such as input validation, parameterized queries, and encryption to prevent common vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and data leaks. So secure coding practices are a set of guidelines and techniques that developers can follow to reduce the risk of vulnerabilities being introduced into the code. When it comes to API development, using secure coding practices is crucial to prevent common vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and data leaks. Here are some secure coding practices that can be used in the API development. First one, use input validation. Validate and sanitize all user input to prevent malicious data from being injected into the API. This can include things like limiting the length of input, filtering out special characters, and checking for proper data types. Next one, parameterized queries. Use parameterized queries when interacting with the database to prevent SQL injection attacks. Parameterized queries ensure that the user input is treated as data rather than code, making it harder for attackers to exploit the system. Next one, we have authentication and authorization. Implement strong authentication and authorization controls to prevent unauthorized access to the API. This can include things like using tokens, implementing role-based access controls, and using secure password storage mechanisms. Fourth one, we have encryption. We have to use encryption to protect sensitive data that is being transmitted between the client and the API. This can include using SSL but TLS to encrypt data in transit and using strong encryption algorithms to protect data at rest. Fifth one, error handling. Properly handle errors to prevent information leakage and other security issues. This can handle things like returning generic error messages to the client and logging detailed error messages for debugging purposes. So by using these secure coding practices in the API development, developers can help to prevent common vulnerabilities and ensure that the API system remains secure over time. Third one, conduct regular security testing. Regular security testing is essential to ensure that the API system remains secure over time. Security testing can include penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and code review to identify any potential security flaws. Regular security testing is a proactive approach to identifying and addressing potential vulnerabilities before they can be exploited by attackers. Here are some ways to conduct security testing. First one, penetration testing. Penetration testing is a simulated attack on the API system to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by an attacker. The testing team attempts to exploit vulnerabilities in the API system to gain unauthorized access to sensitive information or disrupt the system's operation. Penetration testing should be conducted by a third-party security testing firm to ensure an unbiased assessment. Next one, we have vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning involves using automated tools to scan the API system for potential vulnerabilities. The scanning tools can identify common vulnerabilities such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and insecure authentication methods. Vulnerability scanning can be performed by development team or a third-party security testing firm. Third one, code review. Code review is a manual process of examining the source code of the API system to identify potential vulnerabilities or security flaws. This process involves reviewing the code for common security issues such as input validation, access control, and encryption. Code review can be performed by the development team or an independent third party. Regular security testing is essential for ensuring the API system remains secure over time. By conducting security testing, developers can identify and address potential vulnerabilities before they are exploited by the attackers. This helps to reduce the risk of data breaches, system downtime, and other security related incidents that would harm the organization. Fourth one, we have monitor and analyze traffic. Monitor and analyzation of traffic to the API to detect any suspicious activity or anomalies that could indicate a potential security breach. API can be accessed by a variety of clients, including web application, mobile apps, and other third-party integration. Each client request generates traffic to the API, which can be monitored and analyzed for security purposes. Monitoring involves collecting and analyzing logs of the API traffic, which can include information such as request methods, headers, payloads, and response codes. This can help to identify patterns and trends in the traffic, such as frequent requests from a particular client or a sudden increase in traffic volume. Analyze the traffic can help detect any suspicious activity or anomalies that could indicate a potential security breach. For example, if a client is repeatedly attempting to access an endpoint with invalid credential, it could be a sign of brute force attack. Similarly, if a client is sending requests with unusual payloads or header, it could be a sign of an injection attack. So by monitoring and analyzing API traffic, developers can quickly detect and respond to potential security threats. They can implement security measures such as rate limiting, blacklisting suspicious IP addresses, or adding additional authentication layers to prevent or mitigate attacks. Regularly monitoring and analysis of API traffic can also help identify vulnerabilities in the system that need to be addressed through code changes or security patches. Fifth one, we have provide security documentation. So provide documentation on the API security features and the best practices to ensure that other developers can follow secure coding practices when using the API. So in context of incorporating API security testing into the development process refers to the providing documentation that outlines the security features and best practices that developers should follow when using the API. This documentation is important because it serves as a reference for developers to ensure that they follow the same secure coding practices that were implemented during the development of an API. Here are some key points to consider when creating security documentation for an API. First one, outline the security features of the API. Start by outlining the security features that have been implemented in the API, such as authentication and authorization mechanism, encryption, and data validation. This information will help other developers and understand that how to use the API securely. Providing examples of secure coding practices. Provide examples of secure coding practices such as input validation and parameterized queries, and explain how they help to prevent common vulnerabilities. This will help other developers and understand how to write secure code when using the API. Explain security risks and how to mitigate them. Outline potential security risks that could arise when using the API and explain how to mitigate them. For example, if there is a risk of SQL injection attacks, explain how to prevent them by using parameterized queries. Provide guidance on secure development or how to securely deploy the API, such as using secure protocols and encrypting sensitive data. This will help ensure the API remains secure even after it has been deployed. Update documentation regularly. Keep the security documentation up to date by regularly reviewing and updating it as a new security risks emerge or new features are added to the API. In summary, providing security documentation is a crucial aspect of incorporating API security testing into the development process. This documentation should outline the security features of the API, provide examples of secure coding practices, explain potential security risks, provide guidelines on secure development, and be updated regularly to ensure that it remains relevant and effective. So developers should use secure coding practices, conduct regular security testing, and provide security documentation to ensure that the API remains secure over a period of time.